I had vaguely heard of Hugh Nibley, I think, growing up in California. He was sort of a figure of devotion among some of the Latter-day Saints that I knew. But the first serious memory I have of him, I think, is going when I was maybe a junior in high school out to an education week, a BYU education week that was being held in Covina or West Covina or someplace like that at a stake center there. And I heard him speak, and he spoke, I think, 4 times, Tuesday through Friday or something like that, and I was mesmerized, just absolutely fascinated. That was a pivotal experience in my life. Actually, was going to that education week. Some people in my ward decided that I was the kind of kid who might enjoy it. My father at that time wasn't a member. My mother was marginal, and neither one of them was particularly academic. So these neighbors took me there. The Simmons family. I'm grateful to them ever since for that. They took me out there, and it was an unusual education week because the speakers included Hugh Nibley, Truman Madsen, Daniel Ludlow, and I believe Bruce R. McConkie, of all people, spoke. I'm not sure he spoke every night, but he may have. And so it was a real power lineup. And I just ate it up, and I hadn't been thinking at that point of going to BYU or anything like that. But hearing that, especially I think Truman and Hugh Nibley, made me think, wow, if that's the kind of thing you get at BYU, that's where I want to go. When I was a junior in high school, I was only about 15 or 16, so I think I had begun to read some things. So, obviously when I heard that Hugh Nibley was speaking, I wanted to be there. But that's where the real mystique took over. I just thought he was fascinating. This freewheeling, careening trip through the ancient world, and it was just absolutely mind-boggling to me. Well, he was obviously eccentric. I mean, the talks were scattered, as they often were. As I got to know him better and better, I knew that was just his recognizable trademark. But it was part of what made him so fascinating was that he knew everything. He could make connections between widely varying cultures and languages and civilizations. And it was clear that it was just coming to him as he spoke. I mean, he had some plan sometimes of where he was going to go, but it was just all this stuff at his beck and call that he could bring up when he wanted to illustrate a point. And I thought, this is one of the most learned people it is the most learned person I've ever met, ever encountered, and man, if I could be something like that, I'd love to be. Well, I know there used to be a question frequently asked, well, who will the replacement of Hugh Nibley be? And people would propose different individuals, and I've had a few people say, oh, you're it. My own feeling was early on, there will never be another one, partly because he was unique, but also partly because of the moment he came along. I mean, he was the only thing like that there was. Now he's got a lot of people who sort of followed in his footsteps to a certain extent. I've actually compared Hugh to, once I wrote this up and it occurred to me, I think it's still a pretty good image. He's the person who comes across an abandoned house, and he doesn't have much time, but he runs through it with his flashlight and he kind of calls out in the inventory of what's in each room. And then later on, after he's departed or is no longer doing that, comes a bigger, more plodding group, but they also have better lighting, and each of them specializes in 1 or 2 rooms. And so, we've all done a little bit to further what Hugh had done, but no one of us equals him. And I'm not sure that anybody could right now, because the number of journals have increased, the amount of specialization has increased. No one does, or almost nobody does, classical Greek and Arabic and Egyptology and all these different things, patristics, the study of the church fathers. There's just too much. You can't keep up on all of it. But in his day, you have to remember that, when he was born, 1910, church was basically an agricultural operation. I mean, an agrarian population, a small city in Salt Lake, but not very big, not exactly the crossroads of the West. And a lot of our people were in little farming communities in Utah and Idaho and Arizona. We didn't have anybody who was really plugged into the world of sophisticated elite scholarship. But Hugh came from outside all of that. He's born in Portland. He was raised in California. He went to UCLA and UC Berkeley. Was at Claremont and so on before he came to BYU. And he was plugged into that world in a way that almost nobody in the church was at that time. And so he was sort of a harbinger of things to come, I think. But there have been some people who've been very prominent. Jack Welch is one that obviously comes to mind, who's just been incredibly prolific over the years. And there have been a few others. My late friend Bill Hamblin, especially had he lived longer, I think. He had, in some ways, that same capacity. He astonished me perpetually with his capacity to see connections between things that I hadn't seen. Once he pointed them out, I'd think, oh, right, wow. There would be arguments, for example, that critics would make, and I'd think, oh, how is Bill going to respond to this? And then when he came back with a response, I'd think, unbelievable. He did a really good job because he saw things that I hadn't noticed. And there have been a few others over the years. But, for example, Hugh didn't touch Mesoamerica, really. John Sorensen came in there. But my own feeling was that Hugh wasn't going to be replaced so much by an individual as by, and he would have hated this, a committee. Not necessarily an organized committee, but a group of people. So farms, the old farms, which became the Maxwell Institute before it changed courses in 2012, I thought, well, maybe this is it. This is the corporate, the collective successor to Hugh Nibley. We were always struck by the fact that the first generation after Hugh didn't follow him. He didn't have a successor in the immediate next generation. It skipped a generation, and then for some reason, people like Jack and others began to pick it up. He had some students that were unusually good. I remember hearing the legend of Mike Rhodes, for example, who had been in Nibley's Egyptian class, Middle Egyptian class, and was supposedly the best Egyptian student he'd ever had. It certainly wasn't me. I have to admit, I started Egyptian before my mission with Nibley. The mystique was so great. It was a dumb move. I remember in that class, it began with about 6, well, no, maybe more than that, about 15, I think. And then gradually, not very gradually actually, it dropped down to about 4 or 5. And then I remember the final where he handed out a final that was something we weren't prepared for. It was just a photocopy of some pages from the Book of the Dead. It was so far beyond us. I remember most of the people taking the final just got up at about 15 minutes and walked out. I stayed for the whole thing, just staring at it, not knowing what to make of it, with one other person. But there were some people that stood out. I'd heard about them. As I say, Mike Rhodes was one of them that apparently had just done phenomenally well in his Egyptian class, and so his name came up all the time. I don't know if there were others. He didn't tend to choose protégés, but I know he was pleased when some other people began to pick up what he did. I am told, I didn't hear this from him directly, but someone I know talked with him about it once, and he was worried that nobody was going to carry on the work that he had done. And then when he saw farms coming along, he said, okay, I can relax a little bit. They are doing it. If there are successors to Hugh today, in terms of apologetics, it would be collectively the 3 organizations, maybe some others, but those are the 3 that come to mind: FAIR and Interpreter and Book of Mormon Central. And I think Hugh would be very pleased to see what they're doing. I was told, Lou Midgley told me a story of being at Hugh's house when he was in his terminal illness, wasn't feeling very well, couldn't get out, and he was complaining to Lou that he'd been forgotten. Nobody remembers him. And for example, he expected the next issue of the Farms Review, which I was the editor of, but it hadn't come. It hadn't come, so he'd been forgotten. And while Hugh was there, the mail came, and the new issue of the Farms Review was in it, and he was just delighted, that the work was still going on. He got such a kick out of it. His language gifts were phenomenal. I mean, I remember sitting in a lecture with him once where someone asked him a question, and he answered by singing part of an aria from Wagner in German, and then he also illustrated it by reciting from Homer in Greek. And I thought, there are not two people in this audience who can even begin to follow him, but I don't think he was even aware of that. This was the good answer, and so he gave it. His language ability was phenomenal, really, really good. And his memory, I can tell you one story. Many, many years ago, my colleague Stephen Ricks, who would be another candidate in some ways to replace Hugh in terms of language ability and so on, he was a missionary companion of mine in Switzerland. His German was remarkable. But we got back to BYU. Stephen was a grad student in classics at that point, and I was an undergraduate. He'd started earlier than I had. And we had decided at one point that we needed to memorize poetry. That Hugh Nibley had memorized lots of poems and could recite them off the top of his head, so we were going to do it too. And the first one we chose was a poem by John Milton called Lycidas, Lycidas. Okay, so we're sitting in the Institute for Ancient Studies at BYU in the library, and I'm going along trying to recite while Stephen's following along in the text. And I got to a point where I just couldn't remember the next line. Hugh comes walking into the room. He'd heard the previous two lines. He picks it up for about 10 lines and then wanders out the other door. And I thought, this is hopeless. It's unbelievable. I've been working on this for the past 24 hours. Hugh may not have thought about it in 20 years, for all I know. And he remembers the lines and goes on through. It's just casual as anything. He just picks it up, says it, walks through the room, and is gone. And I thought, why am I even trying? One of our concerns is simply there are a lot of people who don't know the name Hugh Nibley anymore. I'm surprised, actually. I mention him in my classes once in a while when an anecdote comes to mind that I'll say, have you heard of Hugh Nibley? And I'm surprised that still quite a few do remember him. Students who were hardly born when he passed away. But still, a lot don't know him. They certainly haven't read him. His books aren't widely available. He's not cited anymore. And also, to an extent, I run into people who say, oh yeah, Hugh Nibley, he's been debunked years ago. And I missed the memo. Now, Hugh would be the first one to have told you, oh yeah, my stuff won't hold up forever. Scholarship changes, new sources come forward. He says, don't hold me accountable for, he used to say this often, don't hold me accountable for anything I wrote more than 3 years ago or 5 years ago. So he would say now, if you haven't made any progress beyond me, what's wrong with you? But we felt that this book was important both to remind people that there was a Hugh Nibley and to remind people that he was a remarkable figure. I mean, just a kind of academic comet that streaked across the LDS sky. And he shouldn't be forgotten. There's never been anyone quite like him. And he sort of invented a whole field of studies of the gospel. And so we think the book and the attendant materials are really, really important, that people need to be reminded of him. Well, I've used the example before of Hugh being the guy who finds the abandoned house and is able to give us a quick, rough and ready inventory of the contents of the house, but because he's just one guy and it's a big house and he's got limited time, can't do it all. But he has given us sort of a floor plan. And a basic idea of what's in each room. So Hugh invented a kind of Latter-day Saint scholarship on the scriptures that we hadn't had before. The closest we'd had to him before maybe was Sidney Sperry at BYU, and Sidney Sperry actually I think is undervalued, but Hugh was just something altogether different and so prodigiously learned and so he kind of invented not just one field, but several fields. Like, these are places you ought to concentrate. You ought to concentrate on Egypt. You ought to concentrate on the temple. You ought to look at ancient Arabia and the Book of Mormon. You ought to look at literary features in the Book of Mormon. Things like that nobody was doing very much of until he came along. So I say he kind of invented the field of Latter-day Saint apologetics. Not quite. I mean, the Pratt brothers were great at that. B.H. Roberts was great. There were some others, but he gave it a whole new style, a whole new flair, and a whole new approach. The Pratts, Roberts, people like that, Orson Spencer, didn't have the ancient languages. They didn't have that kind of encyclopedic global understanding of ancient history and so on. So he sort of gave us the template of how to do things, and the rest of it, well, it reminds me of a line from Alfred North Whitehead about philosophy, the history of philosophy. He says, really, the history of philosophy is like a bunch of footnotes to Plato. And I don't want to say that apologetics and LDS scholarship of this kind is a series of footnotes to Hugh Nibley, but that captures something. Yeah, I grew up in a part-member family in Southern California, and I shouldn't emphasize the part-member because my father wasn't LDS at all. He'd been born and raised a Lutheran in North Dakota, but wasn't practicing really. My mother was marginally active. She went to church once in a while, and there was a sort of social connection to the church and to fellow emigres from Utah. We had some family down there and some others that had come out of St. George with her that she knew. But I didn't grow up going to church very faithfully. And then there was a time in high school, I think, when I became really interested in this stuff, or maybe it was just before high school. I remember staying home one day because I was sick. Now, whether I really was or not, I don't know at this remove, but ostensibly I was sick, and I happened to find a book. I was bored, so I happened to find a book that we'd inherited from my grandmother. And it was a novel called Added Upon by Nephi Anderson, which was a product of the old home literature movement in the early part of the 20th century. And it laid out the plan of salvation. It was, I suspect, kind of like, this is really funny, I'm maybe the only person in the church in the United States who has not seen Saturday's Warrior. But my understanding of Saturday's Warrior is this book was something like that. It took people from the premortal existence through earth life into the millennium and beyond, and it captivated me. I had thought until then that church was just an endless round of really boring meetings and I'd rather be anywhere else. It was not interesting to me. But the plan of salvation, which I don't think I'd ever really caught before, was breathtaking to me. And I knew it was true. I just knew it. It just resonated with me. Now, by the way, could I read that book again? I've tried a couple of times. I really have found it difficult. I haven't been able to. And there are lots of things about it that are so dated and unfashionable and in some ways objectionable. You could accuse it, I think justly, of being slightly racist in a kind of naive way and so on. I think, if I remembered the book well enough, I think I'd agree with that. But that it was a catalyst for me. It got me active. It got me going. So I would go to church without my parents, and it got to the point where I would have arguments with my father. Not brutal knockdown arguments, but he would ask me questions about the church, kind of trying to get me to talk, or I would pick at him with something about the church, and he never made a move to joining. He'd always been friendly. He was sympathetic when we built our chapel on the corner of Rosemead and Walnut Grove. He helped to build it. I mean, he ran a construction business and he brought in some of the equipment and contributed that. So his nickname in the ward was Bishop, but he didn't come. and so I used to pester him, and then the interesting thing is, the Sunday before I went into the mission home, he asked the bishop, we had kind of a party at our house, which was done in those days, missionary farewell. And the bishop came to our house and my father asked him what it would take for him to be baptized. And I think everybody sort of, what? Where'd that come from? Well, apparently he'd been having conversations with my brother. He says, Dan doesn't argue with me anymore about the church. And my brother said, who was actually my half-brother, my father's adopted son. He said, well, because he thinks it's hopeless. You've never shown any sign of budging, so why should he do it anymore? He's just tired of it. And I think that bothered my father, that he didn't want me to go on my mission before he'd made his decision. So he asked to be baptized, and I actually was able to baptize him on the night before I went up to Utah to the mission home. But I asked him afterwards, so what was it that kind of turned the tide for you? And he said, well, I'd always been sympathetic. I saw good people, and they were leading good lives. They were kind and so on. But I'd never really seriously thought about whether it was true or not. It just struck me as kind of a fantasy. So he said, I began to pick up some of the books you had on Hugh Nibley. And he said, gradually the question began to form itself in his mind, could this possibly be true? This might actually be true. And that's what did it. It didn't convince him into joining, but it opened his mind to consider the question. And so people ask me sometimes, well, do you think you can argue people into the church? My answer would be no. Or if we do, I'm not sure I like that, because another argument could come along tomorrow and dissuade them. But if we can open their minds, their hearts, enough to get them to ask, or to get that sort of spiritual witness, then we will have accomplished our mission in that regard. And that's what it did for my father. So when people say apologetics is worthless and so on, I know that's not true. It changed my family. My father joined the church. My mother became active. They were sealed in the temple. I was sealed to them. That was a big deal for us. I have to say, apropos of No Man That's Not History, and that sort of thing. He wrote a couple of other books, The Myth Makers and Sounding Brass. I don't think everybody understood how funny he was. I would read those books and reread them and laugh until the tears were running down my face, because he just showed how absurd some of the arguments were. In the descriptions of Joseph Smith, eyewitness testimonies that would talk about how he was solemn, taciturn, and the same person who knew, another person rather, who knew him intimately. Yes, I knew him. He would laugh. He was jolly. He would laugh till he just shook from the top of his head to the heels of his feet. He had incredibly small hands, says one person who knew him very well. He had enormous hands, says another who knew him very well. I mean, you just had to sort of put those side by side and realize this is all trash. And if they can't even get those little details right, what about the big evaluations of his character that they're offering? They're not right on factual issues, simple, measurable factual issues. One of the things that Hugh did that had a very direct and specific influence on me beyond getting me to go to BYU was I came to BYU. I started as a mathematics major. I really admired mathematicians. I thought this was the intellectual discipline par excellence. If you could do that, it was sheer mental power. Well, I decided pretty early on that this wasn't my thing. I admired mathematicians. I really do. And I still kind of enjoy mathematics, reading about it and so on. Oddly, it's an odd hobby, and I don't do it that much, but I'm fascinated by it. But I decided this was not where I was going to make any contribution. I didn't think I was that good. I didn't think I was that interested to make it really my passion. Meanwhile, a roommate, not a roommate, he was a neighbor in the dorms, was taking a Greek history class. No, he was taking a Greek language class. And I began to think, I would really like to learn Greek. I mean, that's a key to the ancient world, and that's what Nibley did. And so second semester at BYU, I couldn't take a Greek class, but I took a Greek history class. I just ate it up. It was an upper division class. I was a pre-mission freshman, but I loved that class. And thought it was fascinating. And then I immediately began the Greek language when I could. So he had that effect on me. And then another effect, years down the line, I remember a lecture he gave, and he said, whatever you're doing, drop it and study Arabic. Because the Arabs were, if you want to know about Egypt and the pharaohs, the Arabs eventually occupied that land. If you want to know about the Middle East, eventually the Arabs occupied it. And there are records in Arabic that have never been read. And that really hit me. And I began to do Arabic, to tinker with it. There wasn't much to be done at BYU in those days. But the very fact that I'm an Arabist owes to Hugh Nibley. Now, I realized later that was one of Nibley's Arab phases. They would come and go. he'd be really intensively interested in Arabic for a while, and then he would drop it and get off to something else. But he was in one at that point long enough to catch me, and to get me to go and do Arabic studies, and to find, I began to think, there's this whole vast area of the world that no Latter-day Saint has really looked at. And that was true in those days, basically. That there's a vast literature out there, not translated. No member of the church has ever looked at it. We don't know what's out there. And someone ought to look. He made me want to be an academic. I grew up in a family that was thoroughly non-academic. And, you know, we ran a construction business, and I worked in the construction business every summer through high school through grad school. But it was pretty clear to me that I wasn't cut out to be a construction contractor. And it was pretty apparent to my parents and my brother, too. My brother eventually took over the construction business. But nobody ever seriously mentioned the idea of my going into that business. It just wasn't me, and they knew it. Everybody knew it. And so, you know, the question was, what would I be? My mother, I think, wanted me to be a corporate lawyer. Well, no offense, but I could hardly imagine anything I would rather do. Or a tax lawyer. My eyes glaze over at the mention of taxes in the IRS. If you give me prospectuses from a company or something like that, I can't read them. I just can't do it. And so that wasn't for me. And I thought, well, you know, maybe law school. I thought off and on. Even now, the question occurs to me, what if I'd gone to law school? But I know what I would have done. It would have been constitutional law or jurisprudence, philosophy of law. In other words, I probably would have ended up at a law school. It was clear to me that academia was the route I wanted to go. And so Hugh was kind of a model for me in that regard. And so I have to say, it was Truman Madsen. There were a few other really major examples to me of, you know, what I wanted to do and who I'd like to be like.
Okay, this last question is pretty much a repeat of the others. How has Hugh impacted and influenced your life and work? So I think
you know, I can say something maybe a little more. Hugh had a tremendous impact on me in so many ways. But I'd have to say toward the end, one of the things that really moved me about him was to realize how all the intellectuality or intellectualism about him was, that was not fundamentally who he was. Or it was to a large degree who he was. But when it came down to it, I visited him a few times in his house when he was in his last illness. And it moved me to see how ultimately simple his faith was. It didn't rely on all the arguments and all that sort of thing. I heard people from time to time talk about his arguments and they'd suggest that maybe they were a desperate attempt for himself to shore up his own faith, that he needed to find arguments to convince himself. And I realized, getting to know him a little bit, that just wasn't true. It wasn't true at all. He would talk about academia as a game. I don't think he meant that entirely. He was serious in his defenses of the church, but he didn't see it as ultimately the most serious thing. The most serious thing was learning to love and serving in the temple and doing what the Lord wanted you to do. And when I learned at some point, not late in my life or in his, that he'd had a near-death experience, a lot of that became clear. You know, he had an experience where he had questions about life after death. Was there a life after death? He wasn't sure. And he was promised by Elder Ballard. It was Melvin J. Ballard, wasn't it? Who'd been a member of the 12 and now was out. But he came through and spoke at Melvin J. Ballard. Maybe slandering the wrong Ballard. But he came through and spoke in their ward in Southern California and took Hugh aside and said, the question that you're worrying about is going to be settled for you very, very quickly. And Hugh had a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience. And the thing that he learned, well, he learned a lot of things. He said he learned that this life was not really for learning stuff, because he said in the next world you can learn so much faster. He said, I was always worried that my mathematics ability wasn't as good as it should have been. He said, over there I could do all sorts of problems really quickly. I mean, it was just, so you come back here and it's just not the same. You just aren't learning as much. So he learned, as a lot of people learn with near-death experiences, that there were other things that were more important. Love and learning to serve and that kind of thing. But I think the most important directly relevant thing for him was it settled the question of whether there was life after death for him. It settled those questions, so he wasn't worried from that early date. These arguments weren't about convincing himself. Oh, he knew it from personal experience. A prominent member of the church had prophesied to him. That prophecy had been fulfilled. He'd seen the other side. And so to me that was moving, that Hugh's faith was ultimately the same as anybody else's in a way. He had some special experiences, but it was a spiritual conviction, not something he'd reasoned his way to on the basis of the Patrologia Graeca or reading the Egyptian funerary texts or anything like that. He knew it, and the rest was footnotes.
How did his near-death experience come about?
My understanding is that he went in for some sort of tonsillectomy and he swallowed his tongue and blacked out and lost consciousness, and then found himself somewhere else. And he just came back saying, it's true. It's true. I mean, he was intellectually dazzling from the start, but that issue didn't come to him through puzzling out or reading in libraries. I might mention one funny story that I heard about him. When I first came to BYU, I took a Greek history class. I mentioned that. And the teacher was a guy named Russell Swenson, who still has, I think, a chair named after him on campus. I can't recall. There's something named after him. But he was one of the first early Latter-day Saint scholars to go off and get a really good degree outside of Utah, the University of Chicago, in ancient history. And when I came along, he was very elderly. Of course, I was 17, so probably not as old as I thought he was, but I think he was well past what we would call retirement age. And he was just going on and teaching. And I got to know him pretty well because he liked me. I guess I was kind of unique, this weird freshman in his upper division Greek history class who was just eating it up and doing fairly well, which I didn't do in all of my classes of freshmen. The university was a smorgasbord for me. I was taking a bite of this and a bite of that, and so my classes, I forget them, too much here to see, and this vast library that fascinated me. But I did well in the Greek history class. Funny story, by the way, Professor Swenson, in those days, they would send out a failure notice to your parents if you were under 18 and you were failing. My parents got a failure notice, called me up. I said, I can't explain it. I just took the midterm. I got an A. I don't know what to say. And they were not convinced. They were not pleased that I was failing out of the university and that sort of thing. And so I went in to talk to Professor Swenson, and he said, I don't understand. He looked at his roll and realized, oh, I sent the failure notice to the wrong parents. It was the guy just above you. Well, it wasn't funny to me. But anyway, but he told me a story about Nibley. That when Nibley was a young boy, teenager, he would be brought up to talk with the faculty there sometimes by his parents. And he said, we called him the young Aristotle because he knew everything. We'd never seen a kid like that who was 16 or something and so widely read and so knowledgeable about the ancient world. So that always stuck in my memory, the young Aristotle. But he said, I think this is before his near-death experience, quite a bit before it, and he said he was kind of an arrogant young guy, and he didn't seem overly connected to the church. Well, things changed. So,
any idea when or why or how that changed for him?
Well, he went on a mission, so I think something had changed in between. I think the near-death experience may have actually been after his mission. I know it's written down somewhere. I'd have to refresh my memory. But I think it was after his mission. He was still worried about the question of life after death. He just couldn't quite convince himself this was absolutely certain. But he served his mission faithfully. And as a matter of fact, one of the funny things was I served in Switzerland, which was part of his old mission. And there was an old book. I was in the mission home at one point, and there was an old book in the mission home library, and I pulled it down off the shelf, and it had belonged to Elder H. Nibley. I don't even remember what the book was, but it was during his own mission. It was dated during his mission. And I thought that was just hilariously funny. because already by then I had that strong tie to and affection for Hugh Nibley. And in fact, at one point, my mission companion, Stephen Ricks, whom I've mentioned, who's a colleague of mine, teaches Hebrew at BYU, has his office not far from mine. We were both Nibley-philes. That's an impact that Nibley had. There were a lot of us who just saw ourselves as, we were disciples, and that's why we went into the fields we did. But Stephen and I would go out to tract, and I'm not sure we were very effective, because you'd knock on these Swiss doors, nobody answered, and when they did, they slammed the door in your face. It was pretty discouraging. So sometimes we'd get involved talking about Nibley stories. Pretty soon we'd be paused out on the sidewalk regaling each other with Nibley stories until we had to remind ourselves, oh, we need to get going. We need to knock on some more doors. But telling Nibley stories seemed so much more productive than knocking on Swiss doors. When Hugh Nibley was at Berkeley, Stephen Rick's father was also a grad student, getting either his MD or his PhD. He got both. And one day he was with a group of fellow Latter-day Saint students at Berkeley, probably all grad students. They were in a car and they were headed out to lunch. And they saw Hugh walking along the sidewalk toward campus, and they said, "Hugh, we're going to get lunch. Would you like to come with us?" And he was reading a book as he was walking along. He sort of looked up and blinked, and then he had to think for a minute. He says, "Well, let's see. I'm coming from that direction, so I've already had lunch." It's like he couldn't even remember. It wasn't important enough. But yeah, if he's coming from that way, he must have eaten. That's why he's going toward campus. So never mind. And it was a beautiful example of that kind of abstractedness that he was famous for, being unaware of whether he was wearing different colored socks or different colored shoes, or his clothes matched or anything. I remember hearing one story about him, that when he was first at BYU, he would go to the market to get meat or something. And the butcher would sometimes give him extra cuts because he assumed he was sort of a homeless guy. Just didn't know who he was, but he was dressed so poorly. He couldn't be very prosperous, so he'd slip in just a little extra meat for him. I just say that Hugh Nibley is for me a larger-than-life presence in my life. At first you idolize him, he can do no wrong. Since then I've discovered that, well, there are arguments that he made where I think, I don't quite agree with that, or I think he may have misread that document just a little bit. But still, every scholar will make errors. It's impossible not to, unless you simply don't say anything. If you take stands, you will make mistakes, and the field is constantly changing. But Hugh Nibley still stands there to me as sort of an ideal representative of the disciple scholar, the person who dedicated everything he did to the kingdom, who didn't really care about prestige and scholarly applause and that kind of thing. When he set his hand to the plow, he didn't look back, and he was basically called, as I understand it, to come to BYU by John A. Widsoe of the Quorum of the 12, who recognized an incredible talent and felt that the church's university ought to have him. And so Hugh answered the call and came, and I admire that. I've always liked Elder Maxwell's comments about an LDS scholar should have his residence in the kingdom and his passport to the outside, not the other way around. That your residence is in the world outside, and you have a passport into the kingdom. You're kind of an LDS person on Sundays, but a scholar just like every other on other days. Obviously, you've got to pay your dues, learn the skills for whatever field you're doing, but it's a matter of priority. It's a matter of laying it on the altar. And Hugh did that in a remarkable way, and I think as much as anything, that's a kind of model and an inspiration for the generation or generations of committed Latter-day Saint scholars who followed him. I would hope that there would be some people of the rising generation who are trying to decide what they want to do. Maybe they're trying to decide, should I be a scholar, an academic? Should I go into law or get an MBA or be a doctor or something like that? Those other fields are all inspiring and fitting and useful. There's nothing wrong with them at all. And they're honorable. But if a person decides to be a scholar, then I would hope that they might look at Hugh Nibley and see in him a model for the kind of scholar they might want to be. And it's interesting. It's not only ancient studies. That's not the only kind of thing. I've got a case going on right now where we have a set of articles for the blog of Interpreter that were submitted some time ago. And they employ statistical analysis, and what's called Bayesian analysis. And I just wanted to make sure that this was all really sound. The person doing it is well trained in it, but he's not a mathematician as such. And so I thought to myself, is there anybody we can get who could look through this and make sure that we're doing it right? Well, it turns out I had somebody who'd written to me just a little bit before, who's now, he's a PhD in mathematics, fairly fresh, doing a postdoc for several years at Oxford in England. And he had written to me and said, look, in my field, I don't know if there's anything I can ever do to help, but if there ever is, would you contact me? And I thought, you shouldn't put yourself forward like that. You volunteer, we're going to call on you. So he's gone through all of those things to ensure that the mathematics is correct. Then there was a time when the church was under attack over the question of DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I had someone say to me, I never thought getting a PhD in genetics, this would be of any value to the kingdom. But now it seems it can be. So if I can help out, let me help out. And he's one of the premier authorities in the United States, or in the English-speaking world probably, on certain uses of DNA. So it might be just about any field. And yeah, and it's true not just in academia. In every place, people have skills that are unique to them or fairly unusual that maybe they'll never be called on to deploy those skills. Maybe they will. But it's nice to have those people out there and have them be willing to put that on the altar. I think of even my father-in-law, who was an engineer and an engineering executive. And when he was called into a stake presidency in Denver, suburban Denver, he was heavily involved with the construction of, the Denver Temple, but also a new stake center for their stake and things like that. And for branches and new buildings high up in the Rocky Mountains and so on. And I thought, you could not pay him enough to have him oversee those engineering projects, those building projects. But he'll do it for free because it's the kingdom and he's a loyal citizen of the kingdom. And I've seen that time and time again. There was a time when the Russian department was just down the hall from my office, but it still is in a way, Germanic and Slavic languages. And there was a time when just about every Russian professor with a pulse, sooner or later he was called to preside over one of the missions in Russia, because we didn't have any returned missionaries from Russia, but we had people with PhDs in Russian literature. And I thought, what an amazing thing it is that the church has this reservoir of people that it can call on, and they will go. They'll interrupt their academic careers and go on leave for 3 years or whatever and go over and preside over a bunch of 19, 20-year-olds in Russia and use the skills they've developed. And you never know what areas it is where you've got some skill where you may turn out to be really, really handy for something the church needs on a local level or beyond. And I think Hugh's an example for all of us, not just academics in that regard. I hope that young people will see this book, it will read it and see the materials that come out surrounding it and will say, I would like to serve the kingdom. I can serve it in this way, and I will resolve to do something like what Hugh Nibley did. And again, it doesn't have to be even in his specific field. Just I want to be a good scholar for the kingdom. I want to do what I can to help advance the kingdom, even if it's just becoming successful in your field. It's not only to get lots of money or prestige, but it's so someday, maybe, you can be called upon to represent the church. Or that even if you aren't officially called, people will say, I know that person, and wow, he's a Latter-day Saint, and that impresses me. I'll give you an example. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal back when Mitt Romney was running for the presidency, and it was written by Guy Consolmagno, who is a Jesuit and the official Vatican astronomer. And he was telling about a a meeting that they had held at the Vatican about religion and science. And Guy Consolmagno is an astrophysicist, an American actually, trained at MIT and the University of Arizona. And he said that suddenly the conversation turned to the question of specific religions and their relationship to science. And one person spoke up and said, you know, some religions can be reconciled with science, but some are just basically too stupid. They're just dumb. You can't be a good scientist and be one of these. Like the Mormons, for example. And then some others chimed in and said, yeah, that's a really stupid religion. You know, you can't be a reputable scientist and be a Mormon. And Consolmagno, the Vatican astronomer, says, I sat there for a while and I listened. And then I spoke up and I said, you don't know what you're talking about. My doctoral dissertation advisor was John Lewis, Lewis, and he's one of the finest scientists I know, a planetary scientist at MIT, and an outstanding scientist and a devout Latter-day Saint convert. And so he said, you're completely wrong. You're completely wrong. And I thought, this is the Wall Street Journal, and we're being defended in the heat of the Mitt Romney presidential campaign by the Vatican astronomer, of all people. Who would have predicted that one? And I thought, I've got to find out about this John Lewis guy. Well, it turns out he'd made an impression. He was a convert to the church as an adult, as a faculty member at MIT. I don't think we get many of those, but we got him. And he was apparently such a luminous example of the church and of competence as a scientist. He didn't go into the science to prove the gospel true or anything like that, but he was a good scientist and a man of integrity and a man of faith. And that impressed Guy Consolmagno, who becomes a Jesuit and goes to the Vatican with a PhD in astrophysics. But you know, that struck me. And since then I've learned about John Lewis. We actually had him speak at an Interpretive Foundation conference, which he had to do via Zoom because he and his wife, he'd just retired, he and his wife were serving a CES mission in Auckland, New Zealand, directing an institute there. I mean, faithful as can be. And that's an example of someone who's willing to put it on the altar. And he's now recorded something that's up on the church's website about his testimony as an astronomer, just contemplating the vastness of the cosmos and the complexity. And he said, it speaks to me of mind and design and love.